Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa alihi tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Clash of Civilisations. This it's a very spicy title, and many people, when we hear of this, there's different reactions. Some people say, "Oh, this is just a conspiracy theory," and other people say, "Yeah, it's exaggeration." Other people obviously take it a bit more seriously, and other people say there is a conspiracy within a real conspiracy to perpetuate a clash of civilizations. But I want to posit perhaps a more human explanation for what we perceive as the clash of civilizations. And in a way, there is a clash, but I would like to make something very clear. I'm going to mention Western civilization, but when I mention Western civilization, we should not conflate that with the average individual who lives in the West. Most people are well-intentioned, they get on with their lives, they don't have any impact on politics, despite there being a democratic system. But as we all know in democracy, politicians only want your vote, not your opinion. So when I'm going to talk about Western government and Western culture and civilization, I'm not going to talk about, and nor do they have any relation to the average individual who lives in the West, who may be Muslim or non-Muslim, who has no control over their governments. They might subscribe to some ideologies, but generally speaking, they don't wield them in the way that politicians wield them. And so I want to make this separation. Muslims and non-Muslims, we are equally in kind of the powerless camps, but the politicians, they are constituting Western civilization, and their philosophers which go along with them. These are the people I'm going to be talking about specifically. So let's not make that conflation. I will actually perhaps want to ask the audience, put your hands up if you think that there is a war in Islam. Okay, thank you. Put your hands up if you think that the West's only interest in the Middle East is purely economic, and they're willing to do whatever they want to get that, but it's just purely economic. Okay, interesting poll opinion. Well, you're both right. To an extent, there is economic interest and there's ideological interest. But what I'm going to try to posit today is this is nothing which is strange to occur. Communism and what they call capitalism, or just Western ideology of liberalism, whatever, it clashed because they had two conflicting worldviews, both universalist, both believed that the world was divided into two camps. And the free world or the unfree world, or from the communist perspective, the proletariat, the workers, and the bourgeois, the upper classes. So it's not something strange, and it's not a conspiracy theory for there to be a clash of ideologies. It happens all the time, and people accept this. But it's almost like there is a desire from, especially from Western politicians, for you not to think that there is a clash against civilizations, or there's a war on Islam, because the best way to defeat someone is to make them think that they're not fighting. And so you can defeat them very easily. But I'm going to give you some kind of references and evidences for this. Now, first and foremost, the Western idea is based on individualism. It's its creed. And it emerged during the Enlightenment era, what was called the Enlightenment era, not to be confused with the Renaissance era. And in this, it just posited something, that the individual was the most primary concern for political government. So instead of society, or instead of social morals or social values or religion or culture, the individual was more important, or the most important concern, the primary concern of the government. And so the individual, whatever they want to do in their lives, they should be allowed to do so. And this was the kind of first formulation of the theory. Now, of course, it's evolved into almost a theology whereby the individual is this, I call it the Tawheed of the West. The Tawheed in Islam means monotheism. But the individual, the way an individual is described now is with almost religious terms. The individual is the source of inspiration, it's sovereign, it's independent, it's autonomous, the individual. And it's like, That doesn't sound like a human being to me. And human beings, from what I can perceive, are not autonomous and independent. They are dependent. They depend on others. The worst punishment you could put a person through is put him into solitary confinement. If they were truly individuals, they would love it. They say, yeah, great, no other people around. As one French philosopher said, l'enfer, c'est les autres. That hell is other people. Right? So, all right, then why not just enjoy being an individual? No. If no one taught you language, you'd never acquire it. Even as science has shown, past around about the age of 15, if you haven't learned language by that age, you'll never learn it, no matter how much they try to teach you. Kids are found in the wild. If they're past a certain age and they haven't learned language, they will never be able to learn it. And they act in a very animalistic way the rest of their life. It's almost like language is the key to rational thinking. And so, your ability to rationalize depends on other people to teach you language, to teach you the means to rationalize. That goes against the creed of individualism. And there's so many things such as public pressure, groupthink, society, culture. All these things influence and are even greater than the individual and even are longer lived than the individual. You will live and die within a particular culture that you had no control over, but yet it had control over your lives, no matter how individualistic that society is. So all the observations of humans show that humans are greater than just the sum of their parts. There is something more than just the individual human. There is knowledge, language, and society. Society is not just a collection of individuals, as the brother mentioned earlier, but there's something great. It's greater than the sum of its parts. Now, where do you think the conflict lies? When I said the tawheed of individualism, or is the individual, it is everything they said starts with the individual, and the individual makes their choices, and the individual can rationalize independently, and the individual doesn't need any other human beings, and so the aim is to make every individual truly autonomous, truly independent of anybody else. That is their tawheed. Unfortunately, it's a false idol because, as I said, humans, we depend... why do you think we have society in the first place? Why do you think we have economies in the first place? I don't have all the resources I need. I have to trade with you. I have to trade with you services that you might need because you don't have those services. And that's how economies work. And society forms because I have to have social networks to facilitate having a family and facilitate having help. People who actually doing favors for me reciprocating with favors. All these things. And just even company of other human beings. We're not this self-contained island which individualism has promoted. Now, here's the thing. If the Western tawheed believes that the individual is the greatest thing, the greatest conceivable thing in the material universe, and the only thing, the most primary concept, what do you think a civilization based on that creed would react to or would think of not a civilization where the entire worldview is based on the idea that there is only one true individual, and that is Al-Ahad, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one, the independent, the self-sufficient. All these attributes which the West assigned to the average individual, we actually assign to Allah exclusively. Allah is independent. He's truly autonomous. He doesn't need anyone to teach him anything. He's the one that teaches others. He actually taught us language. According to the Quran, he taught Adam the names of things. That's where language originated from. Where do you think language comes from in the first place? Sociologists don't know how to answer that question. Where did language come from? It doesn't spontaneously be generated amongst humans. It's not spontaneously generated amongst animals. No animals use what we'd call language. So then how did language come about? They don't know how to answer that question. We have an answer. Allah actually initiated language within us. So, with this two different perspectives, of course there's going to be a clash. But there's some very important differences. Unlike communism versus liberalism or capitalism is the economic system of liberalism, by the way. Unlike that dichotomy, see, both communism and liberalism have one very dangerous concept, and that is universalism. And the universalism basically states that everyone deserves to have or live by that ideology, whether they like it or not, because it's what they deserve. It's your human right to be under communism or your human right to be under liberalism. So, if it's universal, then that means that everyone must live under it, whether they like it or not. It's for your own good. It's the best benefit possible. That's how they see it. In Islam, we view things differently. Yes, we believe all human beings should be Muslim and embrace Islam and live under the laws of the Creator. However, what the Quran says is that you can't compel people. The whole point of this whole life that we live is a test for humans to voluntarily choose it. You can't force it on people. There was a verse in the Quran saying that had God so wished, He would have made the whole world one community, one religion. Right? So then it tells Muhammad. So then, how can you compel people to believe in the truth when the only real decider of what they believe is God's permission. By God's permission, will someone believe or not believe? So it's not for us to compel people. And if God really wanted everyone to be Muslim or follow the truth, the whole world would have been Muslim, but He didn't will it like that. You see? So for us, although our values aspire to be universal, in practice, they are only for those who voluntarily accept that. And we can't impose, torture, force anyone who's not Muslim to embrace Islam. We can only invite. The word dawah, which sometimes is translated as proselytization, actually means in Arabic, invitation. You invite. And like any invitation, you invite someone and they can accept or reject. Right? It's not like you force them. No, here's an invitation to my birthday, or here's a party, or here's an invitation to my friend's wedding. You can accept it or reject it, and that's how Islam spreads, by trying to persuade people to believe in its ideas and trying to be a good example for people. That's how we try to spread. Now the thing is, but the West, who doesn't believe in any divinely mandated system, and the Western civilization and communists, they never believe that there's going to be justice in the hereafter. So they said, no, there must be justice in this life. And that sounds really good to the ear when you first hear it. Say, yeah, let's not wait for justice in the hereafter. Let's have justice in this life. However, the definition of justice is that you live under their system. And so they're not going to wait for God, or they're not going to say, well, everyone has a choice. No, they say, we're going to make everyone live under a just system as we define it in this life, whether they like it or not. Justice is not voluntary. That's what they believe. And that's why it's dangerous, because they will expand and conquer and impose, and see no problem with doing that. They say, well, if you don't like it, it's just because you're ignorant of it, and it's for your own good. You'll see it's for your own good. Now, am I just saying this? Is it just some assertions? No. And we're going to see, and I will show you, how the modern West came to be and how their thinking developed into these ideas. And just to show you where it came about. Now, one myth I want to dispel is there is no cosmic war between the West and Islam just because it's the West and just because we're Islam. That doesn't exist. I want to make it more human. I want to explain something. When the West first encountered Islam, it wasn't called the West. They never thought of themselves as the West. It was just a bunch of barbarian kingdoms, Visigoths, Frankish tribes, and so on and so forth. They weren't united. There was no ideology common to them. They were mostly Christian, but they never saw that. They just saw that as perhaps their own religious beliefs. They didn't actually see it as any kind of a system or a unified Christendom. That came a bit later, and perhaps in some ways we had an inadvertent influence on this. When some of these Frankish tribes encountered Muslims and there was wars and fighting between the Muslims and these Frankish tribes, Islam believes that people shouldn't be under dictators or shouldn't be under tyrants. They can live under whichever system they believe in, but if the leader is a dictator or a tyrant, then and they oppress their people, then you should at least help these people. And the people who were living in Al Andalus, or we call Iberia, under Visigothic King Roderick, one of the lords escaped Iberia, went to the Muslims in North Africa, said, could you please come into Iberia and save us from this really tyrannical leader? And that's what started Tariq bin Ziyad to go into Iberia and started the conquest of Iberia to save the people under the Visigoths from their oppression. Now, what happened was that some Christian kings, or Frankish, but they were barbarians, they weren't really a kingdom as we'd understand it, but they were kind of mostly tribes. Some managed to resist some of the Muslim armies in France, And the Catholic Church at the time, which was just a clergy, had no power. It was the last remnant of the Roman Empire. They saw a chance. They approached these tribal chiefs and say, you know what, let's make a deal. You need the people under you, because these successful tribal leaders expanded their kingdoms and say, well, you need people under you to accept your loyalty, to be loyal to you and to accept you. So I tell you what, we will sanction you as the approved leader by God. In return, you help fund the church and help fund the clergy and, give us some say in some of your matters. And it will work well for both of us. And in essence, this is how the church acquired power. It was after the European contact with the Muslims. Now, fast forward it a couple centuries to the 12th century, especially around the time of the Crusades, when the church, it was really a coup for the church, the Catholic Church in Europe, to attain much more power, because it used an enemy to say, this is your collective enemy, to the different Christian tribal kingdoms, and say, you need to unite against this enemy, and under our banner. And this got the Catholic Church a lot of power for itself. And it also increases influence into politics, into telling what the Christian kings are to do. Now, something unexpected happened, that Christendom, and now we had the idea of Christendom coming about, where the dominions of Christ, or dominions of the Christians, which was mostly Western Europe. Something unexpected happened, though. They encountered Arabic translations of Greek philosophy and Arabic scripts of science and technology and advancement, and they say, "Wow, this is amazing. We've never thought of the world like this. We've never known about this kind of knowledge. We thought that maybe all knowledge maybe just resided in the Bible or was just passed down by our ancestors. We didn't understand it. There's actually a way to inquire new knowledge, the scientific method." This kind of shocked their system, and slowly they started to build a civilization, starting to acquire these ideas, learn about them, teach them. Now, there's not a myth that most of us are actually under this illusion. The Dark Ages wasn't because of Christianity. Now, I'm a Muslim here. I don't really have any, I don't have any special candle burning for Catholicism. But we have to be honest and objective. The Dark Ages wasn't because of Catholicism. It was because of the fall of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire fell, and it was taken over by barbarians. What do you expect? It's not going to be the high point of human civilization, is it? But the Catholic Church were actually the ones who led on building universities, being patrons of intellectuals and the arts and so on. The church was leading on this, trying to teach and develop, European understanding. And this led to what we call the Renaissance, that's the 12th century. And for 400 years, there was this very long Renaissance, which saw the advancement of learning in Europe, slowly but surely, reaching parity with the Muslim civilization around about the kind of 16th century or kind of 17th century they reached parity with the Islamic civilization. Now, this might seem, okay, all fine, hunky-dory, but there was something that the Catholic Church never anticipated, which was all this spirit of criticism and inquiry and searching for new knowledge generated Christians who said, well, you know what? We're all skeptical about, learning about the natural world and about our old theories and revising this. And this is the natural world. What about the Bible and the biblical interpretation? And that defined the entire power structure of the Catholic Church. So then you saw the rise of people who said, you know what? Why does the Catholic Church get involved in our politics? And who said the Pope is our supreme leader to interpret the Bible? We don't need a Pope. And this started what we call Protestant Christianity. Now you might think, okay, what's this got to do with the West and individualism and liberalism and so on? Well, it's actually very important, because as soon as you saw the rise of Protestantism and Protestant interpretations, and as soon as certain local dukes and kings started to adopt Protestantism and be converted to it, you saw the beginning of religious wars in Europe. The Catholic Church reacted predictably, which is to suppress a challenge to its authority. It had it so good for 400 years, and now it's being challenged. It will try to suppress it. And there was many wars that were started over religious doctrines, religious beliefs. Mostly, the biggest war was on or the biggest reason for the war was whether the Pope should be your leader or not, the supreme leader or not. Now, this caused the Protestant thinkers to find another solution to how you can base a kingdom or a state on. Like, how are we going to base a kingdom? How are we going to base a state on? It can't be the Bible, because it's subject to so many interpretations, and they actually realized that, well, you know, Christianity was never intended to be a religion with a law system in the first place, and we have to find a different reason for it. And then, you know, along came Thomas Hobbes, who said, you know what, it should be a purely materialistic basis. The state should be based on a purely materialistic basis. Whoever is the leader of that state is the absolute ruler, and no popes, nothing else should get involved. And that was the beginning of, you could say, secularism, or an early kind of secularism. Although Thomas Hobbes posited that the leader should only have one supreme leader, and if he wants to rule by biblical laws, he can. But it's up to him, whatever he wants to do, you have to follow him. Then came another Protestant called John Locke. And he's the prophet of liberalism. Right? He brought it. He incepted the ideas. Well, to be fair, maybe some could say he just gathered around a lot of the ideas that were bubbling around him at the time and distilled it into his books. But basically, he started what we'd call modern-day liberalism. And he basically posited the idea that human beings are individuals. And this was a mistake on the misapplication of the scientific method. And you think, okay, what does that mean? How's that involving scientific method? See, Thomas Hobbes and Locke were so in awe of the scientific method. The method whereby you take any substance, you break it down to its little bits, you study what each bit does, and then the entire substance can be understood as the interaction of all these little bits. Right? That's what one method of science it does. And they thought, let's apply that on humans. What's the most fundamental unit of a human? The individual. So we understand the individual, then we can understand how society works. We understand how states work and so on. That was their mistake. The problem is, of course, you can't subject science to humans. What I mean by that is, science only tells you how humans work, as in, we need to eat, what powers our cells, and how we live and we live and we die and all this. Science just tells you how we work. It doesn't tell you how you should live. It doesn't tell you your purpose. In fact, there's so much of you that science can't really look into, such as how the mind works. Not how the brain works, how the mind works. Thoughts, thinking, imagination, ideas. You can't put them in a microscope. So how are you going to decipher how human beings should live just by saying, I'm going to apply the scientific method on a human being? You can't put an idea in the Petri dish, or you can't put purpose in a Petri dish and say, oh, this is human purpose. Oh, okay, this is what we're meant to do. And this led to, this one little error led to the fundamental fallacy of individualism, and then the idea that individuals exist and they pursue their desires, which are materialistic, and should be allowed to do so. And that was basically John Locke's. I'm kind of summarizing John Locke very horribly there, but that, in a nutshell, was what he was saying. Now, here's the thing. Europe had 400 years of technological progress, and there was no liberalism or democracy applied. One big myth that they tell us is, without democracy or liberalism, there's no technological advancement. But Europe had been advancing for 400 years without liberalism or democracy. In fact, it's even more absurd. I mean, the UK only had true democracy in the early 20th century. Yeah, but it advanced just perfectly fine without democracy. Now, I'm not advocating autocracy. That's not a myth. There's only two options. That's a deliberate myth. There's only two options, autocracy or democracy. But that's a different discussion. Now, what happened was that this new idea of liberalism, it spread. This new idea of individualism, it spread, and it caused revolutions. The first revolutions was the Glorious Revolution, as it's called, in the 17th century in England. It wasn't fully liberal Britain at that state, but it started the ball rolling to it become gradually more liberal. You had the American Revolution, which was ironically a revolution against a liberal British Empire. So they were revolting against a liberal state. And you had the French Revolution, a very bloody revolution, which also was on secular liberalism, based on secular liberalism, although it was a very nasty state, with loads of beheadings and assassinations and killings and so on and so forth. It would put ISIS to shame. So, but yet it was the birth of secular liberalism, so it's all good. You see, now here's the thing, these revolutions happened, 19th century, the rest of Europe started to have revolutions, and Catholicism as a political force, it collapsed. These kingdoms, which were under Catholic clerics and the kings, they collapsed and they became liberal states, or there were many liberal revolutions, or they became hybrids, and so on. You had the European Spring was in the 19th century, if you want to kind of consider it like this. And then Catholicism was accepted. Now, here's the thing. The first enemy of liberalism was not actually Islam. It was Catholicism. And if you read the books of John Locke, specifically one called His Letter on Toleration, it's an ironic title, really ironic title, because he talks about saying you should tolerate all different sects of Christianity except Catholicism, because they are dominated by a pope and you can't trust Catholics who are living in your state because they have not a leader, they have the pope. He also said you can't tolerate Muslims because, and I'll let me read you the actual quote of what he actually said. So he goes, that religion that has no right to be tolerated by the magistrate, as in by the government, which is constituted upon such a foundation that those who enter into it thereby ipso facto deliver themselves up to the protection and service of not a prince, of not a leader. It is ridiculous for anyone to profess himself to be a Mohammedan only in religion, but in everything else a faithful subject to a Christian government, whilst at the same time he acknowledges himself bound in blind obedience to the Mufti of Constantinople, who himself is entirely obedient to the Ottoman Caliph and frames the feigned oracles of that religion according to his pleasure. So John Locke, the founder of liberalism, acknowledged that Islam couldn't be tolerated, or the Muslim couldn't be tolerated, because they always had a leader which wouldn't come under the control of a liberal Christian state. We also see John Milton, also ironically the father of free speech and free expression in Britain. He himself said that you can't tolerate Catholics. In fact, you should exterminate Catholicism and exterminate Catholics, provided, of course, you take time to gently invite them to change their ways, to rescue the weak and misled, he said. But after that, you exterminate them. And then he said, because Catholicism is similar to Islam, his exact quote was, if I can get it, is, he says, nay, it was first established and put into practice by the anti-Christian malice and mystery of Catholicism on a set purpose to extinguish, if it were possible, the light of Protestant Reformation and to settle falsehood, little differing from that policy wherewith the Turk upholds his Quran. So, in fact, he was saying that the Catholics are almost like the Muslims in their threat or in their barbarism or what have you. These are the founders of liberalism, the founders of the ideas that became the Enlightenment, as they call it. We also then see in the 19th century the liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill, some big quotes, I'm not going to read it out, but these articles will be available online. If you just type in, it's actually I'm reading from a text I wrote which is called The Making of Western Civilization and the War on Islam. You can search for yourself and please reference it. But John Stuart Mill argues that, first and foremost, it is natural for civilized nations, or basically secular liberal nations, to expand into barbarous nations and treat them as they deserve in any way, even if it's cruelty, that will make them into secular liberals like himself, or liberals like himself. He said that the despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided that their end be their improvement. And he gave some examples of barbaric nations and so on. India, Mughal India, and the example of the French conquering Algeria at the time, which were just Muslim countries and Muslim civilizations. And he said that basically you can justify any treatment of them as you see fit, provided it's not excessive to molding them in your image, to improving them and civilizing them. We also see In Charles-Louis Montesquieu, a French philosopher and politician, he said, "It is a misfortune to human nature when religion is given by a conqueror. The Mahometan religion, which speaks only by the sword, acts still upon men with that destructive spirit with which it was founded." So he says that Islam is a dangerous threat. And he was saying this at a time when Islam hadn't conducted any aggressive jihads for 200 years. And yet he was saying they are a threat, they are barbarians, we have to deal with them. We see David Hume saying the same thing. And we've seen something very interesting. Alex de Tocqueville, who wrote a famous book called Democracy in America, liberal philosopher in the 19th century, he was really nasty in what he said you could do to barbarians to improve them and bring them over to the secular liberal light. And I'll just read one quote. "In France, I have often heard men I respect but do not approve of deplore that crops should be burnt and granaries emptied, and finally that unarmed men, women and children should be seized." This is in his book called Travail sur l'Algérie. And here's what he continues. "In my view, these are unfortunate circumstances that any people wishing to wage war against the Arabs must accept. I think that all the means available to wreck tribes must be used, barring those that the humankind and the right of nations condemn. I personally believe that the laws of war enable us to ravage the country, and that we must do so either by destroying the crops at harvest time or any time by making fast forays, also known as raids, the aim of which is to get hold of men or flocks." And he continues and gets worse, but that's basically what he was talking about as to how you should civilize these barbaric nations who are not embracing the European light. But you might think, is this specifically only to the Muslim civilization? Well, no, it's actually not. We were just another obstacle in their way. They did really horrible things to China. Imperial China, in the 19th century, it was happy exporting its porcelain, and it's called China. But it didn't want to buy any European goods. It was self-sufficient. So we don't want to buy any European goods, but we're happy to export our China to you. And Britain didn't like that. Said, well, we need to get into their market. We need to access their market. How dare they deny us access to their market? So you know what they did? They had what was called the Opium Wars. And why called the Opium Wars? Because the Chinese didn't need any Western products. So they fought wars to break trade boundaries so they can get Chinese people addicted to opium in order to create a market for Western goods. Hence the Opium Wars. So that means that British foreign policy is basically no different to a drug pusher, a violent drug pusher. Because at least drug pusher, if you don't accept the drugs, they'll go on to the next client. But this one actually, by point of knife, would force you to take their drugs. And they've been doing it ever since, it would seem. The sixth President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. So this is a President of the United States. And here's what he mentioned about Islam and Muslim civilization. He says, "As the essential principle of the Muslim faith is the subjugation of others by the sword, it is only by force that his false doctrines can be dispelled and his power annihilated." So we're seeing that the sixth American president is saying that the only way to destroy to destroy the power of the Muslims is to use force to dispel their false doctrines, that's your beliefs, and get rid of your power. And we see Lord Cromer, who was British governor of British-occupied Egypt. He said this, we're referring to the future plan for Egypt. He said very, very, very openly, he said this: "It is absurd to suppose Europe will look on as a passive spectator whilst a retrograde government based on purely Mohammedan principles and Oriental ideas is established in Egypt. The material interests at stake are too important. The new generation of Egyptians has to be persuaded or forced into imbibing the true spirit of Western civilization." It goes on. William Muir, Dr. William Hunter, both governors or worked in British colonial India, mentioned similar ideas as to what the direction they want to take these colonialized natives and how they want to re-educate them into the ideas of Western civilization. In many cases, taking children at force and force educating them at boarding schools. And this wasn't just done with Muslims, by the way. It was done with Native Americans, Canadian Native Americans, Aborigines in Australia, New Zealand. It was done actually quite farther afield. So when I say I don't want you to misunderstand. It's not that the West, Western civilization said we just hate Islam or we have issue with Islam. It was that Islam was just another obstacle in the way of its expansion. That's all. Expansion to every other territory and every other land, and China, South America, wherever. Wherever you're an obstacle, they will smash it down and they will re-educate your children so that you become just like them. And after that, your economy will be dependent on the former colonial masters, which is why it then became neo-colonialism, when they realized it costs cheaper to, instead of actually have your troops occupy these lands, why don't you appoint to leadership people who you've educated and think like you and look up to you, appoint them as leaders, dictate what the economic system is already, and then the people will think they're independent, but really it's the same kind of control, and you save so much money with not having to have your armies occupy lands and have to keep fighting rebellions. You'll save so much money. John Adams actually first posited this as an idea. He said it costs too much to maintain colonies with just having your troops occupying and having the indigenous people constantly rebelling against you. Why not have someone that looks like them, their own leaders, upon them, but these leaders, they think just like you, and they will give you all the economic concessions that you desire. So this is the kind of where the clash of civilizations lied from its historical origins. It wasn't that Muslims or Islam itself was Islam the West woke up one morning and thought, wow, we'll just hate Islam. The West had this very universalist project for the world, and Islam was a tough nut to crack. The Muslim civilization wasn't going to go easy as Native Americans did, because the Native Americans had no unifying ideology that they could rally behind, and they were in a much less technologically sophisticated position than Ottoman Turks were. These Ottoman Turks, they had maybe second-rate weapons, but at least it was wasn't too far behind the Europeans and so on. Now you might think to yourself that, well, maybe this was in the 19th century. I mean, maybe things moved on. This is not the same thinking we have now today. Well, into the 20th century, when the British dismantled the Ottoman Empire, in the 20th century, that you can maybe some of your grandfathers who might be still living might even remember this. It's not outside of living memory. I once met an Algerian man who actually remembered the Ottoman Empire. He never lived under the Ottomans, he was under colonial Algeria, but I mentioned Ottomans, he goes, oh, the Turks. So he remembered it because he was living that time. But here's what, the individual who created the modern Middle East, who divided up all these lands, Sir Mark Sykes, here's what he said was his reason behind this. The guy who invented all these modern states, here's what he said his reason behind this. He says, I want to see a permanent Anglo-French agreement allied to the Jews, Arabs, and Armenians, which will render pan-Islamism innocuous, i.e. neutralized, and protect India and Africa from the Turco-German combine. He also said in 1915 that he wants to see the reduction of what he called the malignant power of political pan-Islam. To defeat the enemy, it is essential to destroy the Ottoman Empire. Here's what he said. The one who created the Middle East, he said these were his reasons for why he believed that the Ottoman Empire must be destroyed. What about the T.E. Lawrence, the so-called Lawrence of Arabia? What did he say? And he was helping some Arab tribes of the Sharif Hussein to take over lands from the Ottomans and help the British during World War I. Here's what he said was his desire, what his intention was to do this. Pursuing British foreign policy, he said, Sharif Hussein's aim is the establishment of a caliphate, not the only one for himself, and independence for people speaking Arabic from their present irritating subjection to people speaking Turkish. His aims are first, indefinite opposition to the Pan-Islamic Party, who are his strong obstacle. His activity seems beneficial to us because it marches with our immediate aims. The breakup of the Islamic bloc and the defeat and disruption of the Ottoman Empire, because the states he would set up to succeed the Turks would be as harmless to ourselves as Turkey was before it became a tool in the German hands. The Arabs are even less stable than the Turks. If properly handled, they would remain in a state of political mosaic, a tissue of small, jealous principalities incapable of cohesion and yet always ready to combine against an outside force. The alternative to this seems to be the control and colonization by European power other than ourselves, which would inevitably come into conflict with the interests we already possess. If only we could arrange that his, referring to Sharif Hussein's, political change shall be a violent one, we will have abolished the threat of Islam by dividing it against itself at its very heart. Now, just to explain some of the points he mentioned, at first Britain thought that we can encourage Arab nationalism and create a Turkish bloc and an Arabic nationalistic bloc under the pretense the Arabic nationalist bloc was one separate caliphate and the Turkish bloc was not a separate caliphate. But soon they discovered they could break up the Arabs into even smaller bits, and they thought, no need to have two rival caliphates, we could get rid of both of them. And when he mentioned that the Turks would be as harmless to ourselves as they were before they became a tool in German hands, the German Empire prior to World War I was resentful of the British colonies around the world. They wanted a piece of the action too. And so they had a great idea. We will help industrialize the Ottomans, we'll help industrialize them, give them weapons, make them a power, and we will use their Islamic networks to encourage Islamic rebellions against British rule in all their different colonies around the world. And so the Germans were actually encouraging jihad, strangely, around the world against Britain. And so Britain said, oh, that's it. I mean, Ottomans were harmless before because they were very, retrograde in their technology. But now that with German industrialization and with German agitation, we will not tolerate Ottoman Empire. Its slow death cannot be guaranteed now. We have to now induce its death ourselves, and we have to break it apart. Now, these was openly admitted. It was a consistent policy towards Islam, towards the Muslim lands, and ultimately in the 20th century to why we see the modern Middle East was the break-up and the elimination of the threat of Islam. It's not a conspiracy theory when it's actually said openly by them, admitted as what their intentions were in the first place. Now, let me fast forward to just today and kind of bring this into relevance. What we see is that Europe expected, or the West expected, two things to happen. One, that after colonialization and nationalism, that Islam would wither away or just become a individualistic religion, much like Christianity was forced into, the same box it was forced into, and it would never play any more any affairs in politics ever again. And two, that the Muslims would reform themselves like the Protestant Reformation, and they would never again implement Islam or go back to the political form of Islam. Ironically speaking, the first word for Islam, after Europe got rid of the word Mohammedan, the first word for Islam was Islamism by French philosopher Voltaire. Islamism was the first word for Islam that the West came up with, because to them it was a political ideology. It had laws, it had political system. So they said it's Islamism. That was their first word for Islam in the 18th century. So when people say Islamism, and when the Europeans say Islamism is an aberration of Islam, that's actually incorrect from their perspective, because for them that was their first categorization of Islam, was Islamism. After Islam became secularized or reformed or whatever, at least secularized or deprived of power, then they said, okay, we call it Islam now. Now we'll call it Islam, not Islamism. Now, we see the comments of the word caliphate coming back to European discourse, to European political discourse. We see David Cameron mentioning it. We see Charles Clarke mentioning it. We even see George W. Bush mentioning it, caliphate. These terrorists want to create a caliphate. And this is something that they never expected. They thought it was dead. They thought, like Catholicism, it's defeated. But Islam just wouldn't die. It just had to come back. And that was their problem. And that's why they started the war on terror. Because how can you declare a war on a methodology? It's silly, right? But you can declare war on an ideology. And the war on terror was used because many Muslims or many Muslim states, or the average lay Muslim, is still laboring under the illusion that was created during the colonial era, that what they are following, Islam as a purely spiritual religion, is what Islam is, and nothing more. Or that Islam has some laws, but this maybe was applied back then, is not necessary for now. And so they don't want to say it's a war on Islam, because that would shake their thinking. It would actually say, oh, really? Why are you fighting against me? Why? And then they would look into what Islam is, and then there'll be an awakening. They don't want to say that. So they will say it's a war on terror and not saying a war on Islam, to specifically target Muslims who've gone back to the original Islam and want to reawaken the original Islam. And before you think, okay, but this idea of the West wanting to reform Islam, it sounds, again, very conspiratorial. No, Lord Cromer, the governor of Egypt, British governor of Egypt, here's what he said: a reformed Islam is Islam no more. Here's what he admits. Right? They admit this. Just now, politicians, obviously, they don't want to say this, but they also are doing the same things. They are funding groups to try to change Islam, like the ironically named Quilliam Foundation in England, for example. Its aim is to counter the narrative that there's a war in Islam, and that the idea of caliphate is extremist. That's what it wants to posit, that the belief in caliphate is extremism, and that it wants to denounce the idea there's a war in Islam. I say ironic because the guy who they named themselves, Abdullah Quilliam, he believed in his sermons during World War I, he said that the World War I is a war on Islam, and that you shouldn't fight in the British army, you should all go into the Ottoman army and fight to defend Muslim lands, and because the caliphate is the shield of the Ummah. Now, why the Quilliam Foundation would name themselves after a guy who's so completely opposite to them, in fact, the very antithesis of them, is like the KKK forming a group called the Malcolm X Institution. It's so antithetical to what they're about. It's just strange. So then you might say, okay, but liberalism prides itself on its tolerance, right? It says we're tolerant, we're a tolerant ideology. Surely, there would be no war in Islam and so on. But liberalism is only tolerant to itself. Liberalism has never tolerated anyone else who has a different ideology. Look how they treated communists, people who just believed in communism in the West. You had the McCarthyite era, you had the witch hunt in England as well, witch hunting communists, because they were viewed as a threat. Now, they're just viewed as a joke, so it's like, okay, we can tolerate them now. They're just a minority now, full of Soviet Union has now kind of made them disillusioned. It's okay, we can ignore them or laugh at them, right? But now, with the rise of the threat of Islamic revolutions in the Middle East, and the rise of the threat of the re-establishment of a caliphate, there are so many political groups calling for a caliphate now. They're very concerned. They're very worried. Now we become on their menu of intolerance. And now you see their external policies: torture, kidnapping, targeted assassination, invasion of countries. Like, for example, Somalia. It was a whole bunch of pro-US warlords. You had the Islamic Courts militia rose up, kicked out all the US warlords, did something that hadn't been in Somalia for 20, 30 years, united Somalia for the first time, actually brought peace, stopped the constant infighting, and lo and behold, what happened? America sanctioned an invasion of that country to deny the establishment of an Islamic system. Why? Because if the Somalis could show the Muslim world that even what you would think would be the most divided society, the most divided Muslim society, if that could unite itself and start rebuilding itself. I mean, the Islamic Court militia soldiers started to they slung their guns over their back and started to rebuild bridges and hospitals. They only had 6 months of a tenure in Somalia, but they started to actually rebuild stuff there. America couldn't have that as an example, and it declared war, invaded, or helped the invasion with Ethiopia as a proxy, and they had to stamp it out like playing whack-a-mole, any way you see Islamic State, whack it. You can't allow it to rise anywhere. And what about internal policies? Well, I'm not going to talk about the US because that's a big discussion. But just in the UK, Islamic charities have been attacked, had their funding attacked. There is social ostracism. So now newspapers are demonizing Islam, demonizing Muslim speakers. Muslim speakers are being banned from coming into this country. We see that peaceful organizations have been banned in Europe. Like, for example, and upheld by the European Court of Human Rights. For example, in Germany, they banned Hizb ut-Tahrir having public events, and the Hizb ut-Tahrir appealed to the Court of European Human Rights, saying, well, don't you say we have a right to at least have public congregation? And the European Court of Human Rights said, well, you don't believe in democracy, so you don't deserve to be protected. Check it for yourself. Check the actual document, the actual ruling. You'll see for yourself what the judge said. The Rafah Party was banned in Turkey by the secular regime. They appealed to the Human Rights Court. Same response was that you believe in Sharia, you don't believe in democracy, you don't deserve the protection, you don't merit that protection. We see that hijab is banned in French schools, or the French are always more militant secularists than the rest of Europe. Niqab is banned in many European countries. Minarets are banned in Switzerland. We see that David Cameron wants to implement a new set of policies that would mean he could put what you call antisocial behavior orders, but the extremist version, whereby any speaker might be peaceful, hasn't broken the law, but they just say, you know what, we're going to put an order on you which means you're banned from public speaking, and any post you put online has to be pre-approved by the government. I mean, like, probably some Chinese people saying, oh, poor English people, you know? It's oppressive government. Dear, oh dear, I'm glad we're under that kind of government. Here's what David Cameron said in the 29th of August, just recently. He said, Britain is an open, tolerant, and free nation. I had to have a straight face while I said that. But we cannot stand by and allow our openness to be confused with a tolerance of extremism, or one that encourages different cultures to live separate lives and allows people to believe in ways that run completely counter to our values. Adhering to British values is not an option or a choice. It is the duty for those who live in these islands. Well, unless you were voting in a Scottish referendum. But, so I'm going to bring it to a close, my discussion. And I really just, in this short amount of time, I could only literally just scratch the surface for you. I have wrote an article about this, which you can go read up. It's called The Making of Western Civilization and the War in Islam, where I extensively quote this. But, to summary, it's not... It's the war between, let's say, the West and Islam is not personal, as in like, oh, we hate Islam because of from the Crusades. No, because they no longer have a Christian foreign policy. Their foreign policy is no longer guided by Christianity. Britain is certainly a very atheistic country now. It's getting much more atheistic. They're not guided by religion so much anymore. They're guided by material concerns and ideology. The fact is there is oil in the Middle East. There is resources in Africa, in South America, in China, and they always wanted access to these resources, and they had superior military technology, so they could access them with force. But they also have an ideological element, and communism was a threat, and they stamped on it. Islam is now becoming a threat to their material interest, and so they are going to clamp down upon it because it's an obstacle, pure and simple. It's not some conspiracy theory or anything. It's just straight up politics. They believe in their way of life, and they believe in it so strongly that they think that everyone must live under it, and that is what justice is. And of course, they're not willing to accept that not everyone believes in their definition of justice. Yeah, we believe in rights for human beings, but we have a whole different understanding of what that means. And different cultures around the world have a whole different understanding of what it means. Not just the Western understanding. That's very geocentric, a very kind of geopolitically centric or Eurocentric rather idea of what these rules are, or these concepts are. So it's because they want to apply their ideology that they're naturally, and you have to expect them to fight to declare war on Islam, because Islam is in the way. But they can't fight against 1.6 billion people, and they don't want to. If they can just keep it as small as possible, they will. And hence they will not say war on Islam, they'll say war on terror. And if you think, but surely the people that they fight against or they demonize are, some of them at least are terrorists. And I say, but when has that ever concerned the West? America, you can go to Florida right now and go into an anti-Cuba terrorist training camp openly. It's there. Luis Posales, anti-Cuban terrorist, blew up a plane that killed 70 people, right? He was indicted by, I think, Ecuador. They wanted America to ship him from Ecuador, to basically rendition him to Ecuador for trial. America said no, because he was with the CIA and he was conducting terrorist operations in Cuba. You can read it. It's not conspiracy. This is like open knowledge. This is the funny thing is none of this is conspiracy theory. This is actually openly known. Some people might find this controversial, but it's actually true. Nelson Mandela, he was fighting against an apartheid regime. Yes, the regime was apartheid. It was racist. It was actually a colonial era relic as well, right, from the Dutch colonialists. That's true. And they were oppressing the people of South Africa. That is true. His cause was correct. His cause was just. But him being, but the funny thing was, his initial cause was for communist revolution. He believed in communism. While that was the case, everyone called him a terrorist. UK, US, everyone called him a terrorist. Right? His group, he set up a group called the Spear of the Nation, with translation Spear of the Nation. It blew up bombs in restaurants, cafes, malls, killing men, women, and children. But when he changed his course from communism to, liberal democracy, oh, now he's a hero. Now Obama's doing selfies with him at his, I don't know, funeral or whatever, right? He used terrorism. I mean, I'm not indicting the cause, as the cause was fighting against racism, against oppression. Yes, I mean, we agree with this. But he used terrorism, but no one cares because of what he was fighting for. Well, after he gave up communism, then they said, yeah, he's a good guy now. The West don't care about methodology, never did. They only care about ideology. And that, my brothers and sisters, is what I propose is where the war lies. Jazakallah.